Hey friends, and welcome to Art Lab. We have something different on tap today, so I'm skipping our usual intro. Rather than a chat, with just you and me, it's going to be a chat with you and me and my brother Kevin Menasco, who is a licensed mental health practitioner. He's a cognitive behavioral therapist, so he specializes in anxiety and OCD. And before you click this off, that is going to be really, really applicable and related to creative practice, because we are, heading into that conversation through a very specific issue that a lot of creative people deal with, and that is perfectionism. But I'm just really excited for you to hear this conversation. We had a great conversation, and I think there's going to be some super helpful stuff here. So if you are somebody who struggles with perfectionism, if you feel like it's something that gets in the way for you with your creative practice, I hope you'll join us, hope you'll stick around. And without any further ado, here is my conversation with Kevin. Kev, I have been really excited to have you on for a while now because, as you know, we were talking about the idea of a podcast last fall, and, you were one of the first people I talked with about it. And, podcast aside, you and I chat a lot. You're one of my closest friends. We talk about thoughts and feelings and the things that motivate us, the ways that we make decisions, what supports or gets in the way of that. And, as a part of that, one of our, I would say, perennial conversation topics is perfectionism. And it's something that, you and I both have struggled with and have dealt with in our own ways. So you understand it like as a human being, you understand it on a personal level. And then you also interact with that subject and support other people through that with your work and your job. So you understand it on like a personal and a professional level. So can you paint a little bit of a picture for us about like what it could look like if you're somebody who struggles with perfectionism? Like, what are some places that it can show up? How can it manifest in like an individual's life?
So something that I see come up a lot is perfectionism within academic performance. Mm-hmm. And that can look a couple of different ways for the same person. So some of the really common examples that I see are, one, avoidance. So think about like a big project coming up, and the closer that project becomes, in all likelihood, the more you're going to be forced to think about the project. And in thinking about the work that needs to get done, and thinking about the amount of time it's going to take, or the effort, or the possible judgment from, peers, if it's a presentation, or your teacher, if it's just like a paper, the closer it gets, the more uncomfortable it can become. And so one way of managing and getting away from some of that discomfort is just procrastination. Just don't do it, right? Or just push it off for another day. And that's certainly a style I used a lot during college, was avoidance, right? And the benefit of avoidance is that in the short term, it's super duper effective at reducing distress and suffering. And obviously there are some longer term consequences where it might actually make the problem more challenging.
Oh, as I say, I can totally see like how, you're talking about it in an academic context, but I feel like there's a very direct translation even to how it can show up in creativity, because, you're anticipating everything from your, fear about like whether you're actually going to be able to execute the idea, to your standards, to like if it's going to live up to what you have in your head, if it's going to be, you're preparing for or anxious about your own your own critical feedback. And then, when it comes time to actually, sharing it or presenting it or whatever, like then that adds a whole other layer.
Right. Yeah. And there's a real risk in doing that, right? There's a risk in stalling the behavior that needs to happen, or whatever creation you're doing or whatever project you're working on, waiting to like feel the right way about it. And that's a problem that we'll probably talk about a lot later, like waiting to feel motivated to do something, or waiting to feel like really confident in doing something. And the challenge is that may never occur, or that may occur well after your deadline. So this general style of avoidance, that's, I think, one way that we could think about how perfectionism might show up. A different way, but I think emotionally accomplishes a pretty similar goal, we could think of as overperformance, or overworking, over practicing. I see a lot of people who will do something like they'll have a draft of a paper and they'll rewrite the draft many times. And in some ways, right, editing work is really important and really helpful and is a great way to learn. But there are diminishing benefits from that practice, particularly if you allow yourself to engage in editing mid-process. So a mistake that a lot of people will make, again, sticking with academics for a second, but we can translate this easily to art, would be something like you sit down and you keep attempting to write the intro paragraph, but the intro paragraph is not as good as you want. You're not saying exactly what you need it to say or hope it will say. And so you keep doing it again and again and again and again without necessarily creating much of the bulk or the outline of the project itself.
So if you're trying to create and edit at the same time.
Yeah. And there can be real challenges in attempting to do that. So you could think of sort of this overworking or reworking the problem as it's a very different looking behavior than avoidance, right? And you could look at that and say, oh, those are completely different things. But in some cases, maybe not all cases, but in a lot of cases, people are dealing with a really similar kind of emotional discomfort, which their attempt at managing that, whatever we want to call it, that fear, that concern around being able to make something really good, that emotion might be really strongly fueling and influencing the behavior. And so we've all, assuming, we did creative writing in like high school, we probably all learned about creating outlines and then doing drafts and then editing them after we have sort of the meat and bones of whatever that project is. Which I'd say broadly is a really great strategy, but yeah, we can step on our own toes by wanting things to be just so, and then struggling when we aren't able to get that result relatively quickly.
So you mentioned, in your description there a moment ago, you mentioned that some of these behaviors, either this avoidance or overperformance, that not starting and not finishing, that they can have some risks, and like the more that you do those things, and the more that those things become kind of ingrained as a part of your process, that can have some risks. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's kind of a big topic, but I think the short version is that we do really well with patterns, and we do really well with repeating specific behavior.
We and being humans.
Yeah, exactly. So thinking about something like little, I generally put my right shoe on. Whenever I'm putting a pair of shoes on, I usually put my right shoe on first. If you ask people like what shoe do they put on first, what pants, like which leg of their pants do they put on first, if you wear makeup, like which side of your face do you start with, most people would be able to answer and tell you, oh yeah, I guess I normally do this side first or that side first. So we know that happens in part because we develop these neural pathways, and the more we practice a particular behavior, like playing an instrument or writing an essay, playing with our dog, right, that there are specific ways that we're more likely to continue engaging in that behavior. And the more that we practice it, the deeper we set those neural pathways. It's like a rut in the road that the wheel wants to fall into and follow. Even if you want to go a slightly different direction, that might be tough because the wheel might be most comfortable falling into this groove that you've created from years and years of practice. So procrastination, for example, like anything, can end up being a practiced skill. And for a lot of us, myself included, I succeeded most of the time in procrastination, meaning that I both delayed getting the work done, and then I was usually able to get the work done and do a decent, passable quality of work within the limited time frame, which makes it more likely that I'm going to want to do that same behavior again, right? Because we usually engage in behavior that either is effective and working for us, or has historically in the past was effective or was working for us. So the more that we practice a given skill, whatever that skill might be, the more likely we are to do that again in the future.
In your experience, do you feel like, is perfectionism usually something that comes up at the beginning, for a beginner, like whatever it is, if it's somebody who's a beginning composer or a beginning painter or even like, a beginning mountain climber, is it something that shows up more for beginners, like at that phase, or can it be present regardless of what phase you're at? Like even if you have a little bit more experience, if you've been doing something for a while, is it possible that somebody like me could still struggle with perfectionism, that somebody who is like established and it has like a track record of like getting things done and putting them out there?
Yeah, I would say that it could show up for anyone. And whether you're starting a new skill or you're just continuing to pursue your own growth edge in whatever field or practice you have, I'd say that it can show up anywhere. And again, just in terms of trying to conceptualize what we even mean by perfectionism, I think we're talking about a pattern where we're giving a decent amount of attention and energy towards wanting an outcome and wanting the final thing that we create or produce or perform to be of a certain quality and caliber. And of course, it makes sense that we have an attachment to doing things well and doing things in a good way, a quality way. But is our attachment towards this long-term goal that maybe we don't have complete control over, is that some kind of a barrier or roadblock to us being able to even start the process or continue the process, whether that's at the beginning, the middle, or the end? So I would say that, yeah, that could occur for anyone.
I guess on that note, of like how ever present and, it's a chameleon, it can change, it can evolve, it can come up in different ways. Like what are, if you're somebody who feels like they're struggling with this, in one of these ways that we have talked about, if perfectionism is showing up for you, if you're feeling really hung up on things being a very particular way, really needing to have a certain outcome, and that makes you have a hard time getting started or saying, okay, actually, this is done. I can share this now. What are some like tools or practices that people could experiment with? If they're feeling like these things are, like you said earlier, if they're getting in the way, if they're causing distress, if they're stopping you from taking action on the kinds of things that you want to do. So if they're stopping you from like making and sharing the creative work that you want to make and share, what are some practices that people could try?
So part of what we would want to figure out is when you do try to make your work, what's happening? What are you noticing? And one of the things we would want to think about is what emotions are getting in the way or showing up for you, or thoughts or physical sensations, like knots in your stomach or nausea or butterflies or shakiness, right? What are the things that you can notice that seem to be a barrier to you doing the kind of work that you would like to do? For you, for example, that you have quite a bit of skill and practice in certain areas. So you're certainly capable of creating work, right? And you've got like a long history of evidence to say that yeah, you're capable of doing these things. So we know it's not necessarily a lack of skill or a lack of ability to work on projects, but rather it might be some really uncomfortable internal experiences or physical experiences. So what I would suggest to someone struggling with this is that we want to start to tear down those barriers that are getting in the way of you being able to function in the way that you would like to function, or start to remove those barriers that are creating suffering that you would rather not have to experience long term. That requires a great deal of vulnerability and bravery, though, in intentionally being willing to practice something that you're not good at already, or practice something that you're not as good as you want to be. That's a really, really vulnerable position to be in, and it's almost certainly going to cause some real discomfort. I think that's a common story I run into. And so I'd say that if you're trying to create work and then your brain is presenting you with this story, or you're experiencing, whatever emotional or physical sensation that's provoking some pain and some discomfort, that's the barrier. And that might be the thing that makes you more likely to go, okay, you know what? I'm going to eat some Pop-Tarts. I'm going to play some video games. I'm going to wait until I feel better, and then maybe I'll try again. Which is fine if you do that every once in a while. But I'd say, again, it's more problematic if that's something that is now routinely happening, where you're always encountering a significant amount of suffering when you're trying to engage in those creative pursuits. So,
and it would also be fine to, like, I'm just going to say this, it's probably a very obvious thing to say, but it would also be fine too if you're, doing that, or maybe, well, you tell me, but I think it'd probably be fine if you're doing that. And, the story that your brain is telling is like, this really isn't interesting to me. Like, I'm not into this. And like, if you're not, the reason it's like actually a barrier, in my situation, or was actually a barrier, is because I really did want to make work. I really did want to make paintings or artwork or whatever I was working on at the time. And those thoughts would, come up and not just make me say, I'll try later, but make me say, I guess I need a new idea. Like, I would just straight up like say, okay, well, I guess I can't do that. And, it felt like it was something that I didn't even attempt to revisit. I would just pronounce that one of them was not good enough and try to move on to another one. So, but if I hadn't actually really been wanting to make work, that would have been fine too. Like, it's, what am I getting at that feels very basic here? Like, just because you don't want to do something doesn't mean you have to do that. Like, if it's not something if it's ultimately in the way, I don't know, maybe that feels like too basic, but I think I'm a little sensitive to the idea of, like, I think sometimes for creative folks, like, there can be such this emphasis on, like, making important work, making uncomfortable work, making work that, like, asks the big questions or, like, challenges the man or whatever. Something that has been really helpful for me, that's been really transformative for me in some ways, has been saying, you know what, it's okay if this part feels too uncomfortable. I don't want to do this right now. I want to do something that feels easier. And that's actually helped me to eventually be able to come back around to these other things that are, like, bigger and more challenging and more uncomfortable. So, it's like a tension, I guess, between, yes, if this is the thing that's, like, if it really is getting in the way for you, then it is a barrier. But if it's just, not where you want to go right then, that's also okay.
Yeah, I think that's an important caveat, right? That it's possible that we talk ourselves into believing or thinking that we're supposed to want to do something, or we're supposed to enjoy something. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a thing that we really will enjoy and really want to do long term. And so, you might have an idea about, like, ooh, conceptually it seems like it would be really cool to do this kind of project or be creative in this kind of way. And then you go and you test it out and you find, that wasn't for me. So yeah, I'd say putting a ton of effort into that would be uncomfortable. On the other hand, I also think it's possible that you could try something, and because it's new, because you haven't done it, you're not good at it. Almost no one is good at something the first handful of times they do it. And for some of us, that is the barrier. That can be really, really vulnerable and uncomfortable.
Feeling bad at something.
Yeah, the first times that I tried rock climbing, like anyone, I wasn't great at it. And I also don't like heights, and I also don't like falling. And so initially, after I went a couple of times, I was like, no, this isn't for me. And I was making that decision, I think, because it was a really uncomfortable practice. And I loved the idea of doing more of it. And so then I decided that I was going to keep doing it until it stopped making me uncomfortable, and then I could decide whether or not it was something I really wanted to do. And then by the time it stopped making me uncomfortable, it was something that I really, really, really enjoyed. So I think, yeah, you're right. Pursue the things that you're excited about, and also realize that some of your ideas, once you test them out and once you're trying them, a lot of them aren't going to feel good initially. A lot of them are going to feel really uncomfortable because maybe you're really vulnerable, or you're having to accept and sit with some of those feelings of not being where you want to be, or comparing yourself to other people, whatever the case might be.
So a couple barriers you've mentioned so far are like, barriers for like how it makes you feel physically. Like, you were mentioning you don't like to fall when you're rock climbing. Other barriers could be like stories that your brain likes to tell. Are there other barriers, or would those be like kind of the two main categories?
Yeah, so I would just add feelings to that, right? So feeling, for example, inadequate, or feeling stupid, or feeling afraid, or panicked. Those could all be reasons that your brain tries to talk you out of doing certain things, or tries to say like, oh, I'll wait until a different time and try it then. Maybe it'll feel better then. Maybe it'll feel better in the future. Which again, doing that some of the time, I think is totally great. We all have bad days, but if that's the pattern, that every time you're trying to do this thing that's important to you, you run into this suffering, then I would say, well, there are ways of changing that suffering, but it requires practice, and it requires some doing.
Okay, so give us some examples of that. So after you've kind of done a little reflection and you're noticing like where these barriers are showing up for you in your creative practice, what are some things that you could try to work through them?
So I think that most things that we do, including creative pursuits, have a component of skill, and that it's not I don't know that creativity necessarily exists in a vacuum. I think whatever kind of medium you're using likely has at least some level of foundational skill that you utilize in that creation process. Yeah. Is that fair? And thinking about creativity as or any creative pursuit, thinking about it as a practice, and knowing that as a practice, what you produce will depend on the day, will depend on the conditions. But I'd say that first there needs to be a bit of a container for that creativity in doing something consistently. The benefit of doing something consistently also means that you have a mechanism for starting to face and sit with and build your tolerance to some of those really uncomfortable physical, mental, or emotional experiences. So here's a really common scenario. Let's say a person is having difficulty with the starting of a project. In my sessions with them, something that we'll do a lot is we'll then take a set period of time, let's say 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and the goal is you're going to start writing something, even if that's let's say it's the outline for a paper. Just start putting words to the page, even if they're not particularly great words, even if it's not the quality that you want. Don't care. The idea is, for 10 minutes, could you practice just attempting to put things on the page? Even if you only put a dozen words, that's great. The idea is that in the beginning, I would say we want to separate what is that ultimate goal. We want to make a distinction between what is that ultimate goal and how do we get there. And instead of trying to achieve that goal in the beginning, what if we focus more on the basics of doing the practice itself? Sort of free of the expectation that it's going to be really great or that it's going to be some awesome thing, but just start with trying to do the first couple of steps in the process. And I think what can then happen that can be really useful in doing that as a practice is that you can still then run into those same thoughts or feelings. And you can start to notice and get curious about some of those stories that your brain is telling you about yourself. What's something I think that's interesting is that certain feelings, the more that we lean into them and like wrestle with them, the worse we feel and the more we have those feelings. For example, something like sadness or hopelessness or helplessness, we know that the research says at least the more that we engage and stew in those feelings, the more we have those feelings. Interestingly, there are other feelings that when we hang out with them in a particular way, they actually get smaller and we have them less and we notice them less. So feelings like fear are a good example. Or worry, concern about being judged negatively, that kind of anxiety. The more that we hang out with it, the less that we experience over time.
Interesting.
And so part of what the practice could be around perfectionism is how do we set these really small, really achievable and measurable goals? Like I said, write for 10 minutes. And even if that means you're staring at a blank document, trying to come up with some words, but all you can do is just stare at that blank document, I'd say that's good enough. And what we would want to do is create basically a pretty repeated practice where almost every day you're doing that same thing. So let's say every day for a week, you're setting the timer for 10 minutes and you're attempting to do some writing for that 10 minutes. I would say that in the beginning, the goal is just we're building that muscle memory of doing the practice, right? We're building those neural pathways so that it's easier to engage in the practice. Especially if it's something new, it's likely to be uncomfortable and our brain is probably going to find dozens of reasons why we could do something else, something better, something more productive. And so just sitting down and forcing yourself to do it and then running into and observing some of those barriers, it's going to be really uncomfortable, but it's not going to be that way forever. It will start to change. And you're also giving yourself more opportunities for that small chance that maybe it is one of those good days where you can make something really cool or you can finally start working on an idea that you feel excited about. And by giving yourself maybe 5 or 6 or 7 of those opportunities a week, you make it so much more likely that you're going to produce something, even if it's an imperfect something, rather than waiting until all of the stars are aligned and the planets are where they're supposed to be right before you're going to attempt to even try. Yeah. So in some sense, I think of this as building a skill around swinging at more pitches, right? A higher percentage of the balls coming in, trying to take a swing. And part of the muscle that I would say really needs to get beefed up for people that struggle with perfectionism is getting better at tolerating making mistakes, getting better at tolerating not living up to what your goal is. And the more that you can be okay with getting it wrong, making something imperfect, making something that's a lower quality than what you're really capable of, the easier it is to have more possibility and more chances, more attempts at making work.
Totally.
So I would say that would be sort of a foundational place to start is how can we create a practice where we allow ourselves to try with the expectation that we're going to try and get it wrong a bunch. And for now, for the short term, kind of see if we can get away from that goal of creating something truly beautiful and unique and world changing. and instead focus on doing this sort of small, achievable piece of the overall work.
What would you say to somebody who's struggling kind of on the other end, not with the getting started, but with like the putting it out there, the finishing, the saying this is done? So, maybe if we have like kind of one creative person, our archetypal perfectionist of one who we've just talked about, like they don't ever start any work. They have all these great ideas and they really want to do it, but they don't ever start. And then we have on the other end this person who maybe has made a lot of stuff and maybe they've even like almost finished a lot and they're just kind of sitting on this pile of creative work. Do you have any thoughts or practices for folks like that?
Yeah, so great question. I think at its root there's some really significant parallels, but yeah, the practice might be a little bit different. So
yeah, how would you tailor it then?
So again, I'd say that the foundation of this is starting to get curious and observe, just through practice and experimentation. What are some of those barriers that arise, like we spoke about earlier? And I'd say that the majority of people that I work with that are in this group where finishing is the challenge, I think some of the barriers seem to be around not wanting to submit work, knowing that they could make it better than it is. And so not wanting to submit something that's 90% towards the goal when they know that maybe if they work hard enough, they could get it to 98 or 99 or maybe 100% of where they want it to be. And so if there were enough time, right, and if there were more resources, they would be able to produce something better. And that discomfort around, again, it's vulnerable to not produce our best work. I think it's vulnerable to do something that we feel is below our capability or our potential. So I'd say that in the beginning, really the intention shouldn't be achieving your ultimate goal. I know that's what everyone is going to be thinking about and that's what everyone is like hungry for. But I'd say that in the beginning, I think the practice is really more about how do we shrink these barriers? How do we shrink these feelings of not being good enough? And how do we shrink this concern that people are going to judge us or that people are going to think we're an imposter or whatever, again, those stories or those fears might be, those uncomfortable emotions might be. So I'd say that you want to build on periods of success. And having many victories is actually going to be much more motivating and much more encouraging for you to want to do more and more and more. It's also, this is kind of obvious to say, but it's an easier lift.
This has been amazing. I always love talking with you, but I am really grateful that you were willing to come on today and share.
Happy to.
I'll do a wrap up in a minute, folks, where I'll do a little synopsis of everything and give you the invitation for the week. But for right now, Kev, where can folks find you?
So my website is whitemountaincd.com. Yeah, sorry.
And that's basically where they can find you. Yeah, because you don't really do social media. No, okay, yeah.
No,
so you can find Kev on his website. I'll have that in the show notes. And are there any resources that you would recommend that folks check out if they're struggling with perfectionism? Any books or websites or anything?
Yeah, I think that there is absolutely loads out there. But a couple things that I think fit pretty well with today's conversation. One would be a book called The Happiness Trap by... Which
has been mentioned multiple times on the podcast.
Oh, okay.
Yes, yeah. Oh, no, that's amazing. Yes. No, this is just, I feel like it's going to be the... Yeah. But anyway, yes, The Happiness Trap. If you have not heard previous episodes, yes. Russ Harris.
Written by a physician, Russ Harris.
Mm-hmm.
He's an ACT therapist. So Happiness Trap is really neat. I would also encourage people to search on this sounds really specific, but the International OCD Foundation, or IOCDF. They have a lot of really cool resources for people experiencing perfectionism. So I take a gander there. Much of that is going to be targeted towards folks that have a really clinically significant level of impairment with perfectionism. But I think the root in terms of what's going to be suggested in terms of managing or having less perfectionism, I think is going to be really, really parallel. So I think those are the two big resources I'd throw out there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kev. Really great to have you on. And yeah, we'll talk soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Bye. So before we wrap up today, I want to just take a minute to do a little synopsis, since I know sometimes when information is in the context of a conversation, it can be a little bit trickier to track the specific points. But just to wrap up, if you are someone who is struggling with one of these presentations of perfectionism, whether it's the trouble getting started kind or the trouble finishing kind, Kevin gave us kind of a framework that could be used for either one of those. And the first step is to have some time of honest reflection. You can do it in the moment while these things are coming up for you, or maybe you can kind of sit down at a more neutral time and think back like, okay, the last time I was working on my creative work, the last time I was engaged in that process, and I had trouble and perfectionism was coming up for me, like what was it actually like? Like, how did it feel in my body? Was I feeling afraid? Was I feeling anxious? And, what kinds of stories was my brain telling? Like, what was the script that was running through my brain? I think we've talked about this in another episode too, identifying what these barriers really are. Kevin talked about, actual like physical world barriers, challenges, and then, like the mental, the thought challenges, like the stories that your brain is telling, and then the emotional, the way that it's actually feeling in your body when that happens for you. So yeah, identifying what those barriers are and getting kind of specific and honest with yourself about that and being willing to be vulnerable about that. And then in terms of like actually working your way past those barriers, Kev's recommendation is to strip things down, strip the process down to its like most essential ingredients. Even if the goal that they have ultimately feels so big and so overwhelming, like it's even more important to strip it down to the minimum requirement, the very baseline element of the thing. So even if you're not actually writing your novel when you're sitting down for those 5 minutes, just sitting down for 5 minutes with the screen on, with the document open, and maybe you're writing something, maybe you're writing anything. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the novel. And for those of you who are feeling like, well, that's silly or that's pointless, and we've talked about this before too on other episodes, but how important it is, and Kev had a unique take on this where it's like very important to give yourself these wins, essentially. Earlier in the episode, we talked about like how our brains kind of get stuck in these ruts of, when we do encounter perfectionism and we're feeling stuck in that and we decide to give up or to delay or procrastinate or whatever any of these other strategies, coping strategies are, we kind of wear that rut in our brain. And the same thing, the reverse can happen if we're willing to take things down to their essentials, down to the very baseline elements and say, yes, I know I can win at this every day. I know if this is the goal, this is a tiny, tiny goal. And yeah, it feels silly at one level, but just the act of actually doing it and completing it and knowing that there's that win can help kind of reshape that pathway. So yes, stripping the thing down to the essential ingredients and just doing like a very small version of that and doing it really, really consistently. And of course, that consistency can look different. The reality of what it looks like to do that practice consistently can be different if you are somebody who's more struggling with the getting started kind of perfectionism versus the having trouble finishing kind of perfectionism. So just identifying like the place that you're hung up, the actual barrier, and then what are the essential ingredients of that actions. Reflecting on where your barriers are, being honest and vulnerable with that to yourself and about that to yourself and then stripping down the thing that you're trying to do, the creative work that you're trying to make to its most essential, very, very, very basic form. And then, letting yourself have the opportunity to win, to actually complete that over and over and over again as you kind of build back up some other, build around those ruts in your brain that have come up from years and years of perfectionism. So the mind ruts. That is it for this episode. Thank you for spending time with me and for spending time with Kevin. And I hope you all liked it. If you did, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. You can also share this episode with a friend. Perfectionism is such a common struggle. I'm sure you do have other friends that deal with it too. So if so, send this episode their way. And yeah, if you try any of these practices this week with your creative work, especially if you're somebody who's had a challenge just hitting publish on stuff, tag me. I'm at Kendall Hilligus. Kevin is not on social media, but I will tell him that you did it if you decided to tackle this. Yeah, and then thank you as always to the team at Wave Podcasting rather, for editing this video. I think that is really, really it. And I will see you all next week. Bye.